what I have the honor and the pleasure to introduce our plenary speaker, Vanita Gupta. I've followed Vanita's career over the years as she's progressed from her initial work as with the ACLU. She's also been on the board of the Southern Poverty Law Center. But more recently, I had a chance to actually work with Vanita when she was at the Department of Justice and heading up the Civil Rights Division. I think what you'll hear from her today will be both provocative and stimulating. I hope it gives you a sense of urgency about your work and what you've been charged to do and what you're thinking about with respect to changing the way America thinks about and uses jail, and more immediately, what a fair, effective, rational, and equitable justice system should look like. I've asked Vanita, as she's changed in her role, how she likes the work. I was listening in on a conversation that she was having with Ed Chung from the Center for American Progress as they were talking about the merits of a bill and the meetings that Vanita has had and so on, as she continues to press forward with respect to justice reform. And I asked her, I said, so how's this job better, different than what you liked? And she said, it's very different, it's still very rewarding, it's still consistent with her goals and values, but she really misses having that subpoena power. So with that, I want to ask Vanita to come up to the stage and share with her what she feels strongly about and most important about, which is the work that she's doing.
Good morning. Lori wasn't supposed to tell everyone about my maniacal moves this morning, but I'm really grateful to be here, and thank you, Lori, for your introduction and for inviting me to participate this morning in the MacArthur Foundation's 2018 Safety and Justice Challenge Network meeting. I really want to thank all of you in this room, and it's a really amazing room, and I'm seeing friends and colleagues that I haven't seen in a while. But all of you in this room are dedicated to a new paradigm for justice and to ending our nation's overuse and misuse of jails. And this is a room, to me, that is filled with people that are not afraid of tackling big and difficult problems. And so I'm really honored to be among you all this morning. 3 years ago, the Safety and Justice Challenge took on a monumental and long-standing crisis. And that was our nation's soaring jail populations. And it's a crisis that requires finding unlikely allies to find common ground and partnerships among everyone who has a real stake in this issue, from law enforcement to public defenders to prosecutors, judges, local officials, advocates, those directly impacted by the system. And it's really a crisis that demands courage, it demands hope, it demands steadfast persistence, because we all know that there aren't any quick or overnight solutions. I want to start, though, this morning just by telling a story about my first cases in 2001. I was 26 years old. I was fresh out of law school, working as a legal fellow at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, when I heard about a drug sting out of a small West Texas panhandle town called Tulia, Texas. On July 23rd, 1999, over 12% of Tulia's Black population had been arrested for low-level drug offenses. Most of the allegations were of sales between 1 and 4 grams of powder cocaine. 46 people were arrested in a town of 5,000, 40 of whom were Black, and the remaining 6 were white or Latino with romantic relationships with African Americans in the town. And the arrest took place during a pre-dawn raid by a team of police that were dressed in full SWAT gear, head to toe. And the local papers ran the headline, "Tulia's streets cleared of garbage." And they printed the names and addresses and charges of all of the 46 that had been arrested that morning. The local sheriff had TV cameras stationed outside of the local jail to capture for local TV the men and women as they were being paraded in. And Tom Coleman, the officer who was responsible for conducting the federally funded 18-month sting operation, claimed to be so deep undercover that he wrote notes of the alleged sales on his leg and he had no corroboration whatsoever to speak of to support any of his claims. The district attorney suppressed evidence in the initial trials of Coleman's prior arrest for theft and abuse of official capacity, and of reprimands that he had received by superiors while conducting the drug sting of using racially inflammatory language and racial slurs about African American residents in Tulia. And so the first 7 men and women opted to go to trial, and they were represented by lawyers who conducted little to no investigation, who received a flat fee for taking on a case. And in many cases, these were lawyers who hadn't tried criminal cases before. The accused were swiftly convicted. They received sentences of between 20 and, in one case, 361 years. After that, in the face of these odds, they made more and more of the women and men who had been arrested made the very rational decision that I would have made in that decision to take plea deals and to receive lesser prison terms. And Tom Coleman was awarded the Lawman of the Year by the state of Texas by the then Attorney General, John Cornyn. And so began my work in Tulia. I drove for hours across seemingly endless flat highways of Texas, beautiful, going from prison to jail to prison to talk to my clients, to meet them. I looked like I was 14 years old, so I inspired no confidence whatsoever. And I spent sleepless nights working. I was freaked out. I was in over my head. I was worried about missing court deadlines and keeping people permanently out of court. And eventually, I assembled a team of really formidable lawyers that I recruited from law firms in New York and Washington, D.C. to help be co-counsel with me in these cases. And there's a lot more to say about this, but over the course of 2 years of a real kind of unearthing and unraveling of what had happened in this drug sting, by 2003, we'd shown that the so-called drug sting was not a victory in the war on drugs, but rather a massive injustice. And then Governor Rick Perry pardoned the wrongfully convicted men and women of Tulia, and we obtained a $6 million settlement to try to begin to compensate them for their lives lost in the breakdown of their community. Now, I am not here to tell you the story to get kudos and pat myself on the back. I'm actually telling it to demonstrate the real ease with which my clients' lives were derailed. They lost their jobs, they lost their children, they lost their houses, they lost their freedom. And really, but for crafty investigative reporting and some halfway decent lawyering, these men and women would be languishing in our prisons today. I tell it too because it forces us to reckon with the racial injustice of our system. I tell it because it highlights how racial assumptions and police and prosecutorial misconduct and a lack of a real, adequately funded indigent defense system came together as this perfect storm in Tulia to yield a grave injustice. And I tell it also because, let's be honest, in Texas in 2001, 2002, and 2003, the odds of winning were remote. My clients and their families taught me this important lesson years ago. They taught me that hopelessness is the enemy of justice, and that there is no choice but in these circumstances to persist. So you all are working to defy the odds and statistics, and it's going to take bold thinking and persistence, because the goal of ending the overuse and misuse of our jails is not going to be achieved by tinkering at the edges. It just isn't. It's going to require new ideas, it's going to require courageous leadership, and it's going to require persistence. So today, you all represent 34 counties, 4 cities, and 2 statewide systems. And that covers a jail capacity of 130,000, or 16% of the nation's total confined jail population. And the significance of this work really cannot be overstated. When the MacArthur Foundation announced that it was going to put $100 million over 5 years to tackle the jail crisis through the Safety and Justice Challenge, I remember sitting at the Justice Department and thinking, oh my God, this is a game changer. This really holds the potential to be a game changer. We know that you can't end mass incarceration in this country without focusing on the booming jail population. 3 out of 5 people, and you all know the statistics, but we have to remember the human beings that are behind them. 3 out of 5 people in jail have not been convicted of any offense, meaning that by law they're presumed innocent. And 75% of those in jail, whether they're serving sentences or being held before trial, are behind bars for nonviolent traffic, property, drug, or public order offenses. And our jails have become warehouses in many places. Warehouses for people with mental illness and substance use disorders, for people who don't have the means to pay for their release, and for people subject to over-policing and over-representation at every stage of our criminal justice system. So the Tulia cases unraveled at a time when our nation was really in the throes of what was then 30 years of politicized criminal justice policymaking, stoked up by Republicans and Democrats alike. Legislators were ratcheting up sentences election cycle after election cycle and criminalizing more and more conduct. And so to me, at the time of the Tulia exonerations, the victory really felt like a drop in the bucket because there was little scope or appetite or conversation about reform. And it wasn't really, as I experienced it, until the mid-2000s when the tide felt like it was beginning to change. And Texas was actually one of the first states to enact significant criminal justice reform. By 2008, others were beginning to follow. And after decades of embracing tough-on-crime policies, state legislatures were finally beginning to push for being smart on crime. And I worked with partners on both sides of the aisle, from Right on Crime and Grover Norquist to working at the ACLU. We knew that we would need uncommon allies and strategic partnerships in the fight for justice. And then in 2014, I was given the rather unexpected and really tremendous honor of leading the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. And I began my tenure just 2 months after Michael Brown had been shot and killed by a police officer in the streets of Ferguson. It had sparked unrest, not just in the St. Louis County, but all over the country, as you know. And the movement for Black lives was really forcing a very uncomfortable but necessary national conversation about the history of race and public safety and justice. We can't ignore the role of law enforcement and the justice system, the role of race and law enforcement in the justice system in enforcing Black codes and Jim Crow segregation, and in ignoring lynchings. Nor can we ignore the distinct experiences of African Americans and other people of color in their daily interactions with the justice system, from being arrested for no other reason than the color of one's skin while waiting around in a Starbucks, to the spate of police killings of unarmed Black men. I spent a lot of time during my 2.5 years at the Justice Department with law enforcement. Policing is an incredibly challenging profession. And the stress and toll of policing in these places where often there's been a complete breakdown of trust is a really important and difficult proposition. And there was a need and an urgency, the fierce urgency of now to really confront these issues. And at the time that I was at the Justice Department was actually building off of the incredible work of so many of you in this room who were doing work and reform at the state and local levels. In a lot of ways, the federal government was very late to the so-called reform party, if you want to call it a party. But we tried at that moment to seize the opportunity to drive progress, from policing to debtors' prisons to bail reform, from access to counsel to sentencing to new paradigms for dealing with people with mental health crises and with mental health issues and reentry. We did what we could to start to end our nation's addiction to incarceration. We started phasing out the use of private prisons and the use of solitary confinement against children and many adults in the federal system. And momentum was on our side. In 2013, you all remember that then Attorney General Eric Holder had launched the Smart on Crime initiative, declaring that the Justice Department was ready to address persistent needs and unwarranted disparities by considering a fundamentally new approach. And we focused on the criminalization of poverty specifically, especially reform of the bail system, of fines and fees, and the overuse of jails. More than a half-century ago, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Bail Reform Act and said, "The scales of justice have been weighted for almost 2 centuries, not with fact, nor law, nor mercy. They have been weighted with money." And his words still ring true today. Because despite decades of established law, too many of America's pretrial systems continue to perpetuate the troubling link between financial means and jail time. And the DOJ investigation of the Ferguson Police Department, I think, laid bare this dynamic. Among the many findings that we made in the course of that investigation, we uncovered emails from municipal county officials that left a trail to a so-called revenue pipeline, meaning that the city was relying on policing to generate funds from its residents. Ferguson police officers were issuing citations for things like excessive fines and fees, $302 for jaywalking, $427 for disturbing the peace, $531 for allowing high grass and weeds to grow on your lawn. And when people couldn't afford to pay fines, they were subjected to arrest, to jail time, and to heaps of new fines that far exceeded the original cost of the ticket. It turned out that these fines and fees practices were not unique to Ferguson, and that they were being enforced disproportionately against the Black residents in the city. The tinderbox that erupted after the shooting of Michael Brown was created long before that day in August in 2014. The Ferguson report really gave voice to the sometimes subtle but dangerous ways that the justice system can corrode a community's belief in the fundamental fairness of its government. And our findings showed how policing and municipal policy sometimes intertwine to cause profound harm in communities. And in the aftermath, we issued a Dear Colleague letter to state and local judges to support reform of unlawful fines and fees and bail practices that can result in an inescapable a cycle of debt and incarceration. And the law is clear that people cannot be jailed for being poor or because they cannot afford the assigned bail amount. We filed statements of interest in ongoing litigation to repeat these propositions, and courts were agreeing. We also tried new approaches. Through an investigation in Hinds County, Mississippi, the Justice Department we had found through an investigation that Hinds County officials had regularly violated the rights of people who were incarcerated. And investigators discovered rampant violence by guards. And people were routinely being held beyond their release dates. There was a significant shortage of resources to respond to mental health issues in the jails. And the consequent settlement that we were able to reach actually ended the practice of jailing people for failing to pay fines and fees and promoted a public health approach to justice reform, including keeping individuals and children with mental illness out of jail. A centerpiece, though, of the deal, which I think was innovative and maybe probably drew off of what many of you are doing in your communities, it was a mandate to form a criminal justice coordinating committee made up of local officials, including judges, the county sheriff, members of the Board of Supervisors, as well as mental health professionals and other local residents and advocates. And the committee was tasked with coming up with alternatives to incarceration, including developing strategies and changing policies to decrease the number of arrests in the county through diversion programs. So the Justice Department was fighting the fight to improve public safety and public trust, because at stake was really the integrity and legitimacy of our justice system. We know that there are very different priorities in Washington, D.C. today, and I'm not going to sugarcoat them. This Justice Department, in just 18 months, has rolled back reforms in progress aimed at building a more just system. The Attorney General has returned to the discredited war on drugs policies, abandoned the Smart on Crime initiative, rescinded the Dear Colleague letter on fines and fees and bail, abdicated the department's responsibility to address systemic police misconduct, a congressionally mandated responsibility, by the way, in the name of local control, and yet is threatening to withdraw funding from the very police departments that locally decide that they are working to protect all residents regardless of immigration status, color, creed, or background. The dismissal of evidence-based research and policy making in DC right now is alarming. But it's exactly in moments like this and during this time that your leadership around the country is as important as it is, and I cannot overstate that. States and counties are leading the way. And across the country, a broad-based movement of people of all backgrounds, across the political spectrum, across stakeholders, folks are pushing for reform. They're testing out new things. They are trying and not settling for the status quo, and in many places, succeeding. And I'm not naive at all about how the Justice Department's bully pulpit and funding streams can have a real impact on local work, on the work to end over-incarceration and to eliminate racial bias in our system. But this is why your leadership matters as much as it does. At the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which I've been leading for just about a year, I have been really privileged to be at the helm of this organization. It's an organization that is both a coalition of 200 national civil and human rights organizations, many of which work on criminal justice reform, but also has a staff of about 60 pushing out program, research, data, working in local communities as well. The organization was founded in 1950 by Jewish and African American leaders who recognized that the fight for civil rights would not be won by one group alone, but would need to be waged in coalition. And the Leadership Conference was for many years the federal arm of the civil rights movement, shepherding every major piece of federal civil rights legislation from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act, through the Fair Sentencing Act, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, and on and on. And today we are deeply invested in smart criminal justice reform, working on issues ranging from policing to sentencing reform. Over the last 2 years, we've actually been leading a working group that has been exploring the use of pretrial risk assessment and their impact on communities of color in the context of bail. And we've learned that our members and partners that are working to reform bail systems and end the use of cash bail, that they are increasingly faced with this question about the impact of the adoption of risk assessment, pretrial risk assessment instruments, what that impact will be on the communities that they're working with, and specifically concerns about embedding existing racial disparities in the system. And so to address this, we've been convening various stakeholders, including defenders and civil rights groups, data and tech experts and mathematicians, to develop a set of principles that are going to help advocates working on bail reform to effectively ensure that the community's voices are centered in these discussions, and that any system that is put in place is really governed by a set of principles that the civil and human rights communities collectively come together on. We've seen the power that our principles have had. We've done this process before on big data, on body cameras, where we have a scorecard on body cameras setting some benchmarks about how they should be used, predictive algorithms in policing. We've seen the power that those principles have had on framing the conversations in these spaces, and we know that this work is going to have a similar impact on our advocacy around bail reform. In our view, it's a critical missing piece to the overall strategy and advocacy to reform money bail systems, in a space where there are too few civil rights organizations actively engaged, and this is a part of the work that we're doing. Any pretrial reform strategy has to include a discussion of the range of risk assessment instruments that there are, because risk assessment is a proposed alternative that, without safeguards and real kind of digging in deep about what these instruments are, without those safeguards, they may not meet the civil rights goals of reducing jail populations and reducing racial disparities in pretrial decision making. And we just need to be honest and clear about that. Because if the goal is to shrink the justice system and make it fairer, we also know that we simply can't reduce the number of people in jail by placing them all in a different system, placing them under surveillance or community supervision. We don't want to be fooled into replacing one system with another. We're in a time that really demands bold action, and it's a time that demands innovative solutions. And some have said that we're in the middle of a pretrial revolution. Yesterday, I was actually at Google, where they announced that they are banning from their platform bail bond ads that prey on low-income communities and communities of color, and within hours, Facebook followed suit. The National Bail Fund, yes, is an innovation, but we all know that all of these developments alone are not a substitute for deep systemic reform. It's going to take a collective effort with all of you in this room and partnerships of all of you in the room. There's a very high percentage, over 90% of jail growth in the last 15 years as a result of pretrial detention. And so we also have to have hard conversations about pretrial and money bond. There's a move to end money bond in America, and I think we have to have some of those hard conversations in this moment. We have to be willing to imagine new paradigms for public safety in this country that don't rely exclusively on criminalization, arrest, and incarceration. And we have to make sure that we aren't driven by what Justice William Brennan called a fear of too much justice. The health and well-being of our communities requires a partnership of everyone in this room. It's a partnership that is committed to restoring legitimacy to our institutions while keeping our communities safe. It's a partnership that is committed to embracing the future of justice reform and transformation while ensuring that that future furthers racial justice instead of entrenching disparities. And rather than fearing too much justice, we need justice to roll down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. So I just want to thank you all for what you're doing. Thank you for being bold. Thank you for persisting, for having courage and hope, and for having the fierce urgency of now, because our communities and the legitimacy of our justice system depend on it. Thank you very much. So Lori tells me I have time for a few questions. And I heard about this cube that bounces around, which I've never seen before, but oh, there it is, okay. I may have stunned everyone. Okay. Did everyone hear her question about what the role is of health departments and health agencies is in playing in helping to produce this new paradigm of public safety? I think that there's a really huge role for health and the health paradigm to play in redefining public safety in America, particularly as jurisdictions move away from a purely criminalization model. It is a real challenge in the areas of substance use and mental health. And one of the things that I think has been important about watching the response to the current opioid crisis, a really tragic crisis that's gripping so many communities around the country, is that it feels distinctly different than some of the prior responses. Now there are folks that say it's because those impacted are of a different race and class in a majority way than, the crack cocaine epidemic, but I like to put a more positive spin on that. I'm not denying that there probably are some of those dynamics at play, but I think that there is a recognition now, and a broader kind of bipartisan recognition, that we aren't going to be able to solve this opioid crisis through arrest and incarceration, and that public health interventions and the role of health institutions and public health strategies in this are going to be deeply important to being able to actually address this crisis and get ourselves out of it. And so I think that this is what the power is of kind of the kinds of cross-stakeholder committees that are getting formed. When we were doing police work and working with police departments around in Seattle and Cleveland and other places where there had been a spate of killings by the police of people in crisis and mental health crises, the most innovative and profound solutions that we were hearing law enforcement really talk about was the success of having these multi-jurisdictional health, public health, and criminal justice intervention committees that were embedded in the police department. So there were mental health folks as first responders and not just people on the scene who would be conducting arrests. So this is a profound part of our rethinking and redefining the paradigm. Now, of course, there's been an underinvestment in a lot of these institutions and agencies and approaches, and this is part of what we need to really be dealing with. Is there has been a willingness to invest percentages of state and county budgets into arrest and incarceration, but how are we now investing in the kinds of health interventions and public health interventions as we kind of move away from that exclusive reliance? I mean what I say when I think you all are the future of this work. You're the present and the future of it. And to me, what's been heartening is that in spite of what's happening in Washington, that the work is really forging forward in local communities and in the states. And that's where the leadership is. And frankly, you all have been leading the way from the beginning. But I do think that we have to push back on what's happening in Washington. I actually don't think that the Attorney General is actually even representative of his own party on these issues. And so, there are those of us that are doing that work in Washington, but the work to forge forward and to innovate and to continue to, Louisiana, Oklahoma, California, states that are continuing to enact reform at the state level, and then the work that you're doing in counties and at the local level, that's incredibly inspiring. And it is inspiring folks around the country to take this on in spite of what's going on. And I think that's what we need to focus on, even as we kind of try to reverse things and get them back to some kind of level of sanity and to be able to follow the inspiring leadership of all of you in this room.
Hi. Thank you so much for what you've done and what you're going to continue to do. I was wondering, how can we connect sites that are involved in this work with the work that you're doing at the Leadership Conference?
So there's, because we are a Big Ten at the Leadership Conference, there are a lot of groups that are very deeply embedded in this work in maybe some of your communities and in the states. And the one thing that I would just ask is that as you're doing this work and you're thinking of who are the stakeholders in your communities, obviously it's prosecutors and police and judges and defenders, but don't forget the role of community residents and advocates who are local and who have the power to bring the real experiences and direct experiences with the local criminal justice system into the conversation, but are also going to be important players in sustaining whatever work it is that you're doing long after MacArthur's money may leave and long after your programs may have been evaluated. The role of advocates and local community members in really kind of creating that demand and holding accountable local officials to the promise of reform, I think is really, really important and can often be forgotten. And, it's a messy bunch where, there are a lot of opinions and there's a lot of views, but I think it centers the work in a different way and in an important way that can affect everyone around the table. And we would, as I should close it up, the Leadership Conference would be happy to connect you up with all of our, we've got a lot of state local partners and would be happy to connect you up with those that have really prioritized this as an issue and are seeking to work collaboratively with the justice system actors in their communities.
Hello. There are two statements that you made that are continuing to resonate with me as we have this dialogue. And one being that don't be fooled with replacing one system with another, moving from jail to surveillance. And the other one being instead of further entrenching disparities, that we're building in systems that help us check that we're doing that. And I imagine part of a practical way to do those things is going to be incorporated into the principal project. But I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more, especially given the initiative focus being reducing jails, that there can be some unintended consequences, as you suggest, of just increasing surveillance in communities. So how we can be a check on ourselves. I'd love to hear you say more about that.
Well, I think the fact that it's embedded in the conversation that you're having and in kind of some of MacArthur's work is really important because part of it just starts with the intentionality around it. There are a lot of places where the answer and the end answer seems to be to move people and to move everyone who is in a particular class in jail into a surveillance mode. And I'm not saying these are very challenging problems. We want to live in safe communities and not naive to what the challenges are. But I think that we have to be intentional about understanding that there are a lot of people in our jails who actually just don't belong in our jails at all, and for whom surveillance isn't the answer, and that's where the health, there are public health approaches and investment that need to come into play for some of this. And when we were in Ferguson and we were doing this reform, and in the immediate aftermath, there were about 30,000 warrants that ended up being dismissed, and people locally outstanding warrants that were dismissed. And people locally thought there was no way that they were going to be able to do that. They would just end up with alternative sentences. Everyone who had an open warrant would end up with alternative sentences. But the sky didn't fall. And you're seeing, in New Jersey, I mean, I know Lori and I were just talking about this, it still needs to be evaluated, but we're seeing tremendous impact where the paradigm has changed so significantly. It needs to be evaluated, but it's had a very big impact. And so understanding that we're not just kind of taking one set of tools and replacing them 100% with another, but actually rethinking the criminalization model and what are those real alternatives that may be outside of the criminal justice system, but actually may result in a greater investment in some of these other approaches and the more public health approaches that there are jurisdictions that have taken and that we should be modeling from. But it's, and the racial disparities piece, I think, is just really, really important. And data is important. It's important to be collecting this stuff, and don't just collect it and kind of keep it in a report, but analyze it and figure out what's happening and what the causes are. And that's, I think, incumbent on all of us doing this work because, we've seen in a lot of different instances where there have been populations reduced in the system, but the disparities increase. And sometimes there's just, there isn't an answer for that, but oftentimes through study and analysis, we can get at what some of those core reasons are. It can be about specific police deployment patterns. It can be about implicit bias in decision making at where there's discretion in the criminal justice system. So that's the piece where I think it really requires an intentionality and an ability to analyze and potentially correct.
I think we have time for one more question, and we have one from the conference app.
Okay.
How can we as the Safety and Justice Challenge promote a national message on bail reform to ensure our message rings true with political leaders rather than the message of bond and their powerful insurance lobby?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I have found that in criminal justice policymaking, the most powerful tools of persuasion are the stories that we tell. And I think that you all are sitting on stories of innovation. It may be in the middle of struggles where some jail populations are going up rather than down, and you're working through that. But being able to talk about what's happening in your community and sharing those stories, sharing the stories of individuals that are impacted by some of the reforms that you're making, that has enormous power, and we should be sharing that at a national level because it's really through examples of what jurisdictions are doing that people are given the imagination. They're kind of triggered to imagine something different. And so I think it's really important to be out there to use a national platform, and the MacArthur Foundation can help do that, but to use a national platform to tell those stories about what it is that you're doing in your communities and even the hard challenges of it, but what your goals are, because that can really inspire others to follow along. So thank you all again for what you're doing all over the country. Really appreciate it.